The nonstop presidential race took several interesting turns this week, but drumming up interest in some state and local races could be a problem. It's too late now for Attorney General Kamala Harris to file criminal charges in the dubious deal over the San Onofre shutdown. And the homeless looking for a shelter under a freeway overpass near downtown will have to look elsewhere. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, Michael Smolens, politics editor at the Union Tribune. Hi, Michael.
Mark, good to be here.
Good to have you back again. And KPBS investigative reporter Amitha Sharma. Hi, Amitha.
Hi, Mark.
Glad you're here today. And Ron Donahoe, editor of San Diego City Beat. Hi, Ron.
Mark, hi. Thanks for having me.
Glad you could join us. Well, California is used to being the political caboose in America's months-long primary season, but not this year. On June 7th, primary looms decisive on the Republican side of the presidential race, and there are a number of state and local races to also engage voters. Let's start there, Michael, on the local side here. Kevin Faulconer appears to be in a strong position. Could he win as mayor outright in June?
He certainly could. We'll just have to see. Ed Harris, one of his opponents, is really making a charge at him, particularly on public safety things. And, the mayor is pretty popular, and I think people like what he's been doing. I think, frankly, just because of the stability, after all, we've had. And that's what Kevin Faulconer's mainstay is, being stable. But there's been a lot of still problems with the police department shortcomings. We've had a lot on the response times and the 9/11 calls. So there are some things that he and others are attacking him on.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. How, he came out of course, to remind everyone, he came out of this sexual harassment scandal with his predecessor, Democrat Bob Filner, and he's gained strength in a relatively short amount of time, and you think it's that stability factor.
Well, yeah, but also if you historically look at San Diego's been comfortable, quite frankly, with moderate Republican white male mayors. I mean, we've had a string of them with some exceptions, and Kevin Faulconer fits the bill. Now, having said that, I think he's done a very good job. He won in a special election, which certainly benefited him. Had he run in a normal election year, it might have been different with the kind of big Democratic turnout we get. Mm-hmm. But he also has, in a political sense, has been really doing a job of working the neighborhoods that he'd be most vulnerable in. He's been spending a lot of time south of I-8, and we've got that sort of almost haves and have-not divide. And he's been spending a lot of time there saying things and bringing some stuff down there, and I think that's working to his advantage. But we'll have to see. The turnout's sort of the wild card, and whether Lori Saldana,
let's talk about his opponents a little bit. Yeah. You mentioned Ed Harris, who briefly served on the council.
Right. He was an appointed council member when Faulconer became mayor, and he agreed to serve only under the condition that he not run for re-election or election.
Career with the lifeguard service.
Correct. He's the head of the lifeguards union. Mm-hmm. So and he's kind of a pit bull. I mean, he's a very aggressive guy, and I don't mean that in a negative way. He's he's
tough politician.
He is a tough politician.
And then Lori
Saldana is a former assemblywoman. Kind of interesting. Was a Democrat. She's running as an independent. And she's got a pretty strong following among the sort of progressive liberal Democrats. Uh-huh. But again, the more high-profile marquee Democrats took a pass on this race. There were other people that Todd Gloria, Lorena Gonzalez, and others, Tony Atkins, people wanted them to run. They just thought Faulconer was too strong.
Right. So it's possible he could win outright if he gets 50% plus one. But with these two folks who pretty much agree, Harris and Saldana on the other side, does that dilute the vote enough that maybe Faulconer gets through?
I think they needed a second person. I mean, Ed Harris was in, and then Lori Saldana came in, and I don't know if the dynamic worked. They just split whatever vote would have gone to one or the other. But if there was just one of them, then somebody would win outright in June. And so their hope is, and they're honest about it, they're not going to win in June, but that one of them can get to a runoff with Faulconer and then hope for the best with a bigger Democratic turnout in November.
So are there any dynamics in the presidential race that might influence the mayoral race? Meaning, I know that Latino voter registration has been boosted because of Trump's statements about building a wall at the border. Might that help any one of the candidates, possibly Saldana?
It could. It's a hard dynamic because to transfer hard partisan politics to the mayor's race is a little dicey. I mean, there are partisan politics, and Kevin Faulconer is a Republican, but he's done reasonably well in a, at least on paper, Democratic city with a, Democratic advantage in voter registration. On the flip side, what Faulconer might benefit from is that I think by the time we get to June 7, there'll be a lot of enthusiasm on the Democratic side, but I think Hillary Clinton will have it wrapped up, if not entirely certainly, you know, all but. And California is still going to be the determining thing in the Republican race, so you may have a larger Republican turnout, and that could benefit Faulconer. So, again, the wild card is the turnout. Now, we don't really know whether that can push him over the top to avoid that November runoff.
And we're going to get more on the presidential. I want to kind of get in the middle on state politics now here. We've got Attorney General Kamala Harris, and she seems to be in charge among this 5-candidate field for the U.S. Senate race to replace Democrat Barbara Boxer.
Yeah, well, we could have a very unique, and I believe certainly the first time in California, of 2 Democrats running for U.S. Senate in November.
Right, wouldn't be a Republican on the
ticket. We've got, you know, the relatively new top 2 primary where just the top 2 vote getters, not by party, go to. And Loretta Sanchez, the Congresswoman from Orange County, is clearly second in all the polls behind Harris. So it's interesting, at their first debate this past week, Sanchez was sort of the target, particularly by the Republicans. Now, there's 3 Republicans who are way down in the polls, and they're just, you know, hoping somehow lightning strikes and they can rise above Loretta Sanchez. But they don't really have the resources to run, you know, that kind of race in California. So unless something happens, we'll be seeing this unique situation of Harris-Sanchez runoff, more or less, in November, which would be totally unique because you'd guarantee to have a U.S. Democratic senator.
Yeah, very unusual. And go ahead, Metha.
Well, one thing that I'm curious about is that clearly the styles of Kamala Harris and Loretta Sanchez are different, but policy-wise, there's very little to distinguish them. So what are voters left with? Democratic voters in the state? I mean, are they simply going to vote based on style?
I think so. You know, it is style. I think that there's also you know an ethnic politics to it with Sanchez and Harris. Sanchez seems to be a little bit more centrist. At least, you know, she's sort of said certain things in terms of, she made some comments about Muslims that were pretty controversial, and she's and she
didn't back away. She really didn't back away from them.
She's got a reputation as a little bit of a loose cannon. What I find interesting in the contrast is that when Kamala Harris was elected, she was immediately sort of christened as this, you know, big political star, almost a rock star that had a national future.
Big up-and-comer.
You know, Sanchez is kind of a gritty fighter. She's risen above expectations time and again, and now she's a member of the Homeland Security Committee and a ranking member of the Armed Services Committee. So she's trying to play her, you know, foreign policy experience, which the others really don't have.
In Washington,
so we'll see. You know, if they do end up in the race, I think it'll be a tough one, and she'll take it to her. But Harris would still be the odds-on favorite.
And I should note, Amitha, you're going to be hosting a forum with the Senate candidates on KPBS
on May 10th. May 10th, it'll be the second
7 o'clock on
Senate
KPBS TV.
Yes.
Okay, and we'll look forward to that. Well, let's shift now to the presidential race, which
you mean the quiet
the quiet one, which is
the one that's gone unnoticed.
and as you mentioned, will Republicans and ironically deep blue California be the ones to put Donald Trump over the top, or not, or stop him with Ted Cruz?
I think he's going to be the nominee, and I think it will happen here. You know,
I would have fallen off this chair if you'd said that a year ago.
Well, but keep in mind, I mean, it's a Republican primary, so you know, it's not a matter of the fact that Democrats have a huge margin. You know, that's a matter in November, but you know, he's competing among Republicans in California, and the interesting thing that will be worth watching is Ted Cruz has been organizing in California for a very long time, and everybody across the board says he's done a very good job. Whether he can do enough to overcome Trump, now Trump is, you know, got this populist appeal, and polls show him leading or in neck and neck, but it's interesting. What it really comes down to is not a statewide popular vote so much, but congressional district by congressional district. You win a congressional district, only among Republicans, you pick up 3 delegates. So they could go into the bluest district and have, you know, basically make it easier on themselves to target those districts to pick up
very few number of relatively voters.
Exactly,
on that side,
exactly. So it gets very complicated, but and I think somebody had done some surveys showing he's leading in the congressional districts.
Cruz?
No, I'm sorry, Trump. Yeah.
Trump. Ron, I want to bring you into this. We had a little bloody showdown last night in Costa Mesa, and known, you know, vanguard of protests, but a Trump rally there, and a guy got bloodied up. There were some arrests and all. We're going to see a lot more of this between now and June here as these candidates swing to California.
I mean, I can't predict whether that will happen or not. I certainly hope not.
There's so much at stake, though.
Yeah, there's no place for that. You know, we're not going to see it on the Democratic side. But yeah, that's just not called for.
Well, actually, this weekend is the Republican State Convention up in Burlingame outside of San Francisco, and Trump had spoken noon on Friday, and there were big protests outside. It was unclear whether they got. I mean, things did get a little violent at Costa Mesa, I think a police car window gets smashed.
Yeah.
At one point, folks were trying to rock over a police car, but then they cleared
Trump
them out.
supporter had some blood, and that picture went around. All right, real couple seconds left here. Trump go over the top in California here. Does he actually secure it here?
I think so. You know, there's that possibility that he'll fall a little bit short, but I think regardless, despite all the machinations, how much we would love this big open convention, you know, if he's like 30, 35 delegates short, it would be very hard for them to overtake him. And frankly, I think that the Republican establishment is finally close to giving up this whole, beating Trump thing. I just think it hasn't been working. We'll still have to see how the last primaries play out, but I think that Trump will be the guy.
And still a long, long way, of course, to the election in November. Well, we're going to move on. And speaking of Attorney General Kamala Harris, she has drawn the wrath of some consumer advocates for her handling of a criminal investigation into the San Onofre settlement. Harris earned congratulations with a raid that uncovered a secret deal that advocates say harmed ratepayers over the costs of closing the crippled nuclear plant. But Amitha, your story this week talked about a critical deadline that has now passed. Tell us about that. Explain what went on.
Well, in fact, Kamala Harris's own investigative team very eloquently lays out the chain of events leading up to this San Onofre settlement agreement, which you discussed in your opening, which puts ratepayers on the hook for $3.3 billion. Her investigative team basically says that that secret meeting between former state utility regulator Michael Peavy and an executive from Southern California Edison,
big utility that ran the plant.
Right, violates a couple of different laws. One is you can't have ex parte communications. In other words, a secret meeting like that while there is an ongoing investigation. And at that time, the Public Utilities Commission, of which Michael Peavy was then the head of, had opened an investigation into who bore responsibility for the San Onofre radioactive leak and who should pay for it. So that was a violation on that account. Secondly, if you do have an ex parte communication like that, that could constitute obstruction of justice and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The latter is the more serious one. It is a felony. Now, that secret Poland meeting took place in March of 2013, so the statute of limitations is 3 years on conspiracy to obstruct justice, and the legal clock ran out on that last month. The other two, the ex parte communication violations as well as obstruction of justice, the legal clock on that was about a year, and so that's already run out as well.
Okay, so by letting this investigation go and the clock has run out, is there anything that State Attorney General office can do to step in and get involved on the criminal side, even though they're still investigating?
Well, it is unclear at this point. I mean, Southern California Edison has basically accused Michael Peavy of pressuring the company to contribute $25 million to UCLA for greenhouse gas emissions research. And Kamala Harris's team has described that as inappropriate interference in the settlement process. Basically, Edison is saying, he put pressure on us to make this contribution in turn for his support on the settlement agreement. However, it's hard to imagine how a jury would convict Peavy of pressuring an energy company to contribute millions of dollars to an education institution like UCLA.
Which is seen as a thing for the public good.
For climate change research, right? However, I think the reality is that a jury would probably be infuriated, find objectionable the fact that Peavy, the judge in the San Onofre case, flew thousands of miles away to Poland and met in secret with an executive from Southern California Edison to basically write a deal that then charged consumers, the other side in this case, who was not present, their representatives were not present at that meeting, billions of dollars.
Now, you wrote about a similar situation, somewhat analogous, back in San Bruno, California. Remind us of that event and what Harris did.
So back in 2010, there was a natural gas pipeline explosion, and 8 people were killed. There was evidence showing that PG&E did not properly maintain the safety of those pipelines. Kamala Harris did open an investigation into that. The federal government handed down indictments in that case after the state statute of limitations ran out in that case.
So she didn't issue indictments there either.
Right, but her office says, look, we were working hand in hand with the feds in that case. However, State Senator Jerry Hill, whose district includes San Bruno, says, look, you know, California has a vibrant judicial system. It would have been nice to have state charges in this case. You know, it was in Kamala Harris's own backyard, as well as federal charges.
I mean, is there a why here? Was it just like negligence? I mean, these are huge cases. The San Bruno one, people died. Obviously, down here, there's a lot, billions of dollars at stake, and yet the clock ran out. I mean, is there something else there? Or is it just,
I posed, I posed the question about the statute of limitations to Kamala Harris's spokesman, and he said, look, you know, we can't talk about an ongoing investigation. So he didn't address the statute of limitations specifically in my emails. However, you know, the suggestion has been made that she's trying to deliberately run out the clock until after the November general election, until after her U.S. Senate campaign is over. Her office's response is, look, you know, we're going to go where this investigation takes us.
But if the statute of limitations, it begs the question, why are you still investigating?
I think the argument is that there might be other elements of this investigation that we, at this point, are not privy to.
You know, it's interesting, just going back to the political discussion we had earlier, and while she and Loretta Sanchez, there might not be a lot of distance between them philosophically, will we start looking at records, and will these things kind of come up? Because these are kind of pretty big problems for her, I would think.
That's the question that swirls around in, I think, reporters' minds a lot. People who are, like, especially with Jeff McDonald, who's written a lot on the San Onofre case. Yes.
Reporter, yeah.
You know, I think people in San Diego County and people in probably parts of Orange County who are familiar with San Onofre and who have been following this case closely probably know about her investigation a little bit, but even that might be a stretch. How many people know? How many people care? Is unclear to me. And I don't know that any of her opponents are going to seize upon this issue in her U.S. Senate
Maybe after
campaign.
your story.
Short time left on this topic. Would the U.S. Attorney here get involved in San Onofre, as we saw up north in San Bruno?
Right. So I posed that question to our U.S. Attorney Laura Duffy last week, and she said she simply didn't know enough about this case to offer up an opinion or make a decision.
I mean, how can you be the U.S. Attorney here? It's kind of a big case. Even if you just read the newspaper, you'd kind of know about it.
For the past 2 years, this case has been in the headlines.
Okay. Now, what would ratepayer advocates like Attorney Micah Geary, who you interviewed for this story, what would they like to see happen ultimately?
Well, I think that they have been beating the drum to have the feds come in and to seize the initiative in this case because, according to federal law, conspiracy to obstruct justice has a statute of limitations of 5 years. So there is maybe some latitude to do something more there.
Okay, so we may yet see all of that. Well, we'll have to see and follow on how this all plays out going forward. Well, we'll move on now. The city finds itself between a rock and a hard place, pun intended, after installing a bunch of jagged rocks under an Imperial Avenue overpass near downtown San Diego. The idea is to keep the homeless from camping there. And Ron, start by telling us this new rock garden. Where is it, and kind of describe it for our radio listeners.
Yeah, it's on Imperial Avenue at 18th Street, and it's right where there's a I-5 overpass. So
on the eastern edge of downtown there.
Yeah, it's right on the border of Sherman Heights, okay, and right on the border of quote unquote downtown between District 3 and District 8. Okay. So the city has begun installing a rock garden, if you will, pointy, jagged rocks on the side of the sidewalk under the bridge where many homeless had been sleeping. Mm-hmm. The first person that really found this and started documenting it was a guy named Michael McConnell, and he does a Facebook page called Homelessness News San Diego, and he's got about 15,000 followers. And he put these pictures up on his Facebook page, and the page lit up. People were calling it soulless and heartless, and doesn't the city have better things to do, and this isn't a solution. And it was sort of deemed the pest control solution.
Antagonizing these folks who are just trying to stay dry and somewhat warm under the overpass.
Right, and making it akin to the spikes that you put up on a roof to keep pigeons away.
So it got pretty nasty then.
It did, and so there was that reaction, but there really was actually a complete opposite reaction from the residents of Sherman Heights.
And what did they have to say about it?
They actually had been talking to the city, and they'd been talking to David Alvarez, their councilman, about doing something about this problem. The residents didn't know what was going to happen. They were requesting better lighting. They were hoping that maybe some art could be put in there or some sort of enforcement. The rocks is what was put up last Friday, 1 week ago from today. It's a project that's still going on.
Now, how much did it cost, that project, to get done?
The city says it's going to cost $57,000.
Right. Not a huge amount of money, but for the record.
But an amount of money that people are complaining, hey, we could do something else.
Something better with that, yeah.
So the people of Sherman Heights, I spoke to one activist who told me that the people there do not have a lot of cars. They do a lot of walking through that particular underpass. They go to their service jobs in downtown. And so it's a walkway that they need to use, and that it is filled with many, many homeless people who they say are often relieving themselves or exposing themselves to women and children that go through there. So it was really two sides of a coin when these rocks started going up.
Yeah. Well, it really does put politicians and leaders in a tough place. Michael, you've been around here a long time. This is a tough political issue, homelessness to begin with. The city's tried to address it here lately with some shelters and more money. But then something like this comes up and it kind of gets to the whole, on-the-ground neighborhood side of it.
Well, giving away my age a little bit, but, when the gas lamp district was a horrible place at one point.
Oh, yeah.
And there was a lot of homeless. And when they started redeveloping that, they moved folks, and folks went up to the park, and they tried to get them out of the park. So there is that classic,
East Village.
Exactly, pinching the balloon, and, it expands elsewhere. And Ron is right that the residents asked for this. I think that Mayor Faulkner had a news conference about another issue there, and they came up to him and said, can you do something? So there is a lot of support for that because, it's tough for the homeless, but it's also really tough for the residents that had to traverse that area for the reasons Ron said. But, the sort of, unintended consequences. One resident said, yeah, it's kind of good, but now I notice people are sleeping on my block. So they haven't really moved that far. And now, is it better to have them under an underpass or in a residential neighborhood, which some people are suggesting is starting to happen. So I don't know if it was entirely thought through in that way.
Right.
Both sides are really pointing fingers at the mayor's office and saying there has been a lack of leadership on this. The Sherman Heights folks, if you want to call them the compassionate for the homeless side,
the advocates,
say that the mayor has brought forth an initiative this year. He announced in his State of the State address back in January,
State of the City
address, that he was creating a Housing Our Heroes initiative, and that the goal was by the end of this year, by the end of 2016, the city will house 1,000 veterans, specifically veterans. So that program is underway. I checked in with the San Diego Housing Commission recently, just last week. So as of mid-April, they're at 29. So that's, an inauspicious start. They're at 29 on their way to 1,000 with, 8 months left to go.
How many months left to go? Yeah, it doesn't seem like it's going to be successful, does it? Now, what about, you mentioned Mayor Faulkner, David Alvarez represents that district, Todd Gloria heads a council on homeless issues. What are they saying about that from the city council side?
So both of them said to me that they were not aware that this project was being undertaken, and they both fairly tersely said that was not the way that they would go about solving the issue of homelessness.
Now, the advocates we've talked about here, are they offering solutions? Obviously people wish we had a lot more funding and more permanent housing, et cetera, but have they come up with some in this immediate situation to say, hey, we should do this instead, or why not use that $50,000, $60,000 somewhere else?
Well, you might be referring to the tiny homes solution. That is, I guess you could say, a stopgap that's being offered.
Explain what that is.
Finding parcels of land downtown where small, maybe I think 4x8 homes.
Very small houses, little trailerable homes.
Yeah, I think probably 2 people could sleep in them, door, windows. I applaud the people who have put this idea forward because they are trying to do something as opposed to nothing that's really happening on the situation. I don't see that as a permanent solution. really the problem is a lack of housing. And also housing that is available that landlords may not want to rent to homeless. In particular, I do know that that's part of what the Housing or Homeless initiative is trying to do outreach to landlords. And again, from the Housing Commission's numbers, they told me that they'd pulled 55 units in from a dozen or so new landlords.
Well, we'll have to leave it there for now. We'll see if this does become an issue in the mayor's race and moving forward in some of these council races as well.
Definitely will be a factor in the District 3 city council race.
All right. Well, that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Michael Smolens of the San Diego Union Tribune, Amitha Sharma of KPBS News, and Ron Donahoe of San Diego City Beat. A reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.